Welcome, everyone. My name is Bishnupriya Gupta. I'm Research Director of CAGE. It is my pleasure to introduce Mirko Draca, who's the Director of CAGE. Mirko is my colleague, and he and his team have been working on the future of work in the UK. Most of us have been, at home working, at least in this audience. And we now are asking the question, do we really go back to our offices, and how often, and how, if at all? So to answer that question, Mirko is going to tell you about the project they are working on. This is the first presentation, and this is going to lead to a policy report to be launched in October 2021. So without further delay, I hand over to Mirko to tell us about the future of remote work in the UK. Over to you, Mirko.
Great, thank you, Bishnu. Okay, so thanks to everybody for coming along. What I'm going to do is speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll hand over into like a question and answer section where you can ask questions through the kind of YouTube live stream chat feature. Okay, so revolution in progress, the rise of remote work in the UK. This is building on some work that we've been doing at CAGE at Warwick with the team of Emma Decini, Roland Rathalow, Arthur Turrell from the ONS, and Julia Battaglione. We've got a briefing paper online at the CAGE website. Those of you who registered for this event and signed up should get it in an email, a link after this presentation. So let's kick off. Okay, so I think there's been a general sense that, since the start of the pandemic, last year, stuff is going to change, right? So something will change here, is the way I put it. The pandemic has seen a lot of hype about social change. Pick your slogan. There's the new normal, the great reset, build back better, leveling up. There's a lot to choose from. But I think, we're empirical researchers, and we think that now enough data is accumulated for us to say more solid things about the coming kind of post-COVID reality. Our focus today is on kind of remote work and this process, this big sort of breakthrough during the pandemic of this normalization of remote work, right? So the pandemic kind of was this kind of big experiment with remote work, right? And one way to look at remote work economically is as an organizational technology. And as part of this big organizational experiment, we've invested in the tools and practices needed to make remote work. A big ingredient to what's going on is kind of the solution of the coordination problem. To make remote work well, you need to have a lot of people doing it at the same time, and the pandemic sort of organized that for us. And I think a good way to summarize how we perceive what's happened with respect to remote work during the pandemic is this quote from Eric Brynjolfsson from MIT of this idea that 10 years of structural change in the organization of work has basically been compressed into 6 months during 2020. But that's the background. We all know about this. What are the numbers on remote work as it's evolved over the last year or so? Fortunately, the ONS has been keeping tabs on this for us on a regular basis. So this is data from the ONS's Opinion and Lifestyle Survey. This is a survey they've got out in the field every week, which is collecting data on kind of work habits, the state of the labour market, plus lots and lots of other stuff that could bear on how society and the economy is coping during the pandemic, right? So, weekly data on well-being, for example. And here, I think the best thing to focus on is this green line, which is giving you the share of people working from home, employees working from home during any given week in the pandemic. And what we can see here is that it's hovering between about 20 and 35, let's say 38%, over any given week during the period of the pandemic. And it's reaching this low of about 20% at what you would think of as the peak of openness in the economy, right? So that period in September when there were relatively few social distancing restrictions. Alongside this, you've had this constant 10% of workers who are kind of in some partial space of where they're working from home a bit, and they're also traveling to a workplace outside of their home for some of their working days. And then I think interestingly, you actually have quite a big proportion of people who've been working outside of their home in a traditionally defined workplace 5 days a week throughout the period of the pandemic. So this is kind of the weekly data that we have on working from home patterns over the last year. I think that period around September 2020 is probably our best snapshot of the future of what a post-social distancing labour market is going to look like, at least in the medium term of the next few years. Surveys like the work that Paul Meisen's team at Nottingham have put together, they show that workers have got a strong preference for hybrid work arrangements, that is, some days of work at home and other days of work at a traditionally defined workplace. So what we can expect in terms of these earlier numbers is that the size of this green group is going to shrink and they're going to be lumped into this red group, right? So we're going to have kind of a dominant set of hybrid arrangements in the labour market in terms of working from home. But I think, the kind of the variation, the restrictions during the pandemic, the social distancing restrictions sort of sets us up for a strong expectation of what I would call an 80-20 labour market, right? Where around 20% of work is done from home, either kind of on the basis of, employees working full-time from home or people working partially from home. We might see that go up to about 70-30, right? And I think the surprising thing for, I guess, most of the types of people watching this presentation is that, we're professional and managerial workers or general office workers, is that, this figure of 20 to 30% seems low compared to the normal situation that kind of we think about, right? And so there, the thing to remember is that, it's going to be an 80-20 labour market, but there's going to be variation across workplaces and across sectors. So that's kind of what the likely situation is going to be. Now, as I said, the pandemic has been this big experiment in the organisation of work. What are the findings of this experiment, and what have we learned to do better or do differently as part of this experiment, right? And so specifically, we want to think about how is the frontier of remote work changed, right? So how much did the pandemic change what we thought was feasible to do via remote work? In terms of the basic economics of this, we know that certain tasks that we do at work don't need face-to-face interaction, and then some tasks, they need a bit of face-to-face interaction in principle, but we can substitute away from them in principle, and hopefully substitute away from them with low cost, right? And so what we do in this work is we're kind of studying this movement of the remote work frontier, is this question of to what extent did the pandemic change the feasibility of doing work remotely. So to conduct this work, we use a big, rich database on kind of online job vacancies from the information company Burning Glass Technologies. This represents about 40 million UK job vacancies since 2011. As the saying goes, this is rich, granular, high-frequency data. In order to measure remote work, we build a text algorithm, a text search algorithm, to flag up phrases that indicate that a job has got remote work opportunities. So kind of this is a straightforward operation that we just throw up against the big database, looking for all of these kind of traditionally defined sort of keywords about home-based, work from home, remote working, more antiquated terms that you would think like telework, telecommuting, virtual job, which are in the data, right? So, so we use the Burning Glass data to sort of pull out the frequency of these words within job ads and classify a job as potentially remote or at least partially remote just based on the presence of these keywords. So as I said, we know that remote work feasibility is based on tasks, on whether a task can be done remotely or not. And we know that occupations are made up of tasks. And therefore, the spread of remote work across occupations can tell us a lot, right? Based on data, so previous data on the instance of remote work across occupations, and based on basic common sense, we would have expected that professional and managerial occupations would have been the occupations that are most likely to go remote in a really big, heavy way. And that does seem to be the case, right? So this is data coming out of our Burning Glass analysis of Burning Glass data, where we've collapsed the data down to SOC1, one-digit occupation level. And this is showing you the share of vacancies per SOC1 occupation over the different years of the data from 2018 onwards, right? So what we see here is these big leaps in the amount of kind of remote work that's being offered in vacancies in the labour market. And what we think is kind of most surprising, and this will come out in the regression analysis I present in a second, is that there have been these big unexpected leaps, at least at the kind of naive kind of level of looking at the means here, in these categories such as administrative work and sales. So here what you're seeing is like this massive jump where kind of remote work was a very kind of very ultra minor activity before March 2020, and these kind of massive jumps in the share of vacancies that are offered in terms of remote work in these areas of administration and sales, which had this perceived kind of less feasible aspect to them in terms of the performance of remote work before the pandemic. So we're seeing this big shift in administrative and sales occupations. In terms of the modeling, what we can do is control for the pre-pandemic pattern of remote work to gauge how unexpected this shift was, right? So here we're using data from a paper by Hensvik, Labonchen, and Rathalo, so our co-author Roland Rathalo, where they've built up this measure of the feasibility of remote work prior to the pandemic based on US time use data, right? So this is kind of essentially time diary data on how people are spending their time across work and leisure in households and in workplaces, which gives us a picture of where remote work was done before the pandemic. And what we can basically do is take this information and what we do here is like look at it at the 4-digit level and then control for this pre-existing or pre-pandemic feasibility of remote work to see to what extent were these jumps in the amount of remote work going on in different one-digit occupations, to what extent is it an unexpected development. And here is the basic kind of regression results. What we're seeing here is that this HLR, remote work feasibility measure, this is a really good predictor of where remote work increased during the pandemic. But then there's this kind of leftover variation of where kind of remote work increased beyond what we would expect based on this feasibility measure. And what we see is that kind of the most well-defined sort of unexpected increases above this benchmark indeed took place in administration and sales, right? And we estimate that this distinctive extra effect of remote work, or this extra increase in remote work in administration and sales amounts to about 20 to 30% of the overall increase in remote work that we saw in those occupations, right? So there's been this distinct shift out of the frontier of what we thought was feasible in administration and sales relative to before the pandemic. Okay, so that's what's happening on the intensive margin. So we've seen some pushing out of the frontier, but in the main, across most occupations, remote work has increased where we expected it to increase. And we didn't necessarily learn a lot about how to kind of do more tasks remotely, right? So we learned a bit in these areas of administration and sales, but elsewhere it sort of proceeded as you could have expected, right? So that's telling you what's going on in terms of the intensive margin of remote work, of like how jobs are done, right? So there's been change, but it's broadly changed as we expected. Then the other aspect of what we want to think about for the future is what we would think of as the extensive margin, that is the distribution of jobs. How is kind of this increase in remote work going to affect the distribution of jobs that's out there, right? In short, the basic way to think of this is that higher levels of remote work out there in the economy and the labour market are going to create new patterns of demand and supply, and those new patterns of demand and supply are going to shift around the composition of jobs, right? Before looking at that, though, the first thing to note is the really unusual labour market that we're living in right now. And I describe this as the sort of suspended animation labour market. Okay, so this is data from the ONS and HMRC. So this is data coming off of the HMRC's payroll data, right? And what this is kind of giving you is the sort of the flows of labour market turnover per month in the UK economy. So this is saying that in any given month in the UK economy, you've got you know, 600,000 people kind of flowing into a new job, or 600,000 people flowing out of an existing job, right? So this is sort of this process of labor market turnover, a process of reallocation, a process of creative destruction. And, you know, what we see here is like this very unusual development in the history of kind of labor market reallocation, where we have this kind of massive fall in the amount of turnover or churn in the labour market. So we have this kind of massive fall in both inflows and outflows as the pandemic essentially froze a lot of economic activity, and we had kind of major unprecedented policies like the furlough kick in, right? So you can see here, early on in the pandemic, we had this big phase of job outflows, job destruction, redundancies. Policies like the furlough and other support policies put a lid on that, but essentially we've had this sort of long phase of stunted labour market turnover. And this figure just sort of brings that out, where we add up inflows and outflows just to show how radically labour market churn has changed, right? So what we're seeing here is that, you know, the labour market is still about 15% less dynamic, or has 15% less churn than before the pandemic. Now, it's hard to gauge based on the sort of publicly available data, like how much of that is the furlough, right? So the furlough has by definition frozen about 4 million workers on average into sort of, you know, their existing jobs. You know, even at best, the furlough is probably going to account for maybe 13% of that overall minus 15% drop. Even a minus 2% drop is a pretty radical change in the pace of labour market reallocation. But I think that the major thing to note for us sitting in the labour market at the moment is that this is an unusual labour market where reallocation has been frozen. As the pandemic ends and social distancing ends, we're going to see sort of some reallocation take over and some catch up in reallocation. Okay. And so, you know, what I want to think about now is, you know, let's think about, rather than, you know, in the tradition of like 2020 and doom scrolling, like rather than the green sheets of recovery, the green shoots of destruction, right? So when reallocation takes over again, what kinds of patterns might we see? And in this sense, you know, the high frequency granular data that we have in the burning glass data helps us track what's going on the vacancy side of the economy and compare what's been going on to the economy before COVID, right? So I think the obvious effect that you see in the data, the pandemic era data, is what I call the save our sandwiches effect, right? So that's essentially this reduction in city centre related economic activity and hospitality related economic activity. That's the stuff that's very elastic to social distancing restrictions. In our research, where we think things are sort of distinctive or particularly interesting, or things that we need to watch, is in sort of other structural effects of the pandemic on vacancies. So this is something we sort of zoom in on. There's more information in the policy briefing. What we do here is we're looking at the one-digit occupation shares of vacancies for a selected set of vacancies that we think are kind of representative or provide a good comparison in terms of what's going on, right? So the green line is giving you the share of vacancies that are for managerial positions. The blue line is giving you the share for administrative positions, and red for sales positions. And what you can see here over this period that we covered from 2017 onwards is that there's been this big drop in the share of administrative and sales positions, right? And so even now, a year and a bit on from the pandemic, you know, we've had this reduction in the overall share of administrative vacancies. Obviously, stuff like sales was hit hard by the second major lockdown starting in late December. And the thing that you've got to remember with this particular figure is that this is kind of the data represented in terms of shares, right? In terms of the volume of vacancies, we're still below, or we're only just recovering in some areas to the same level of vacancies that we're seeing before the pandemic, right? So labour demand in volume terms has gone down, right? And if we sort of look in volume terms in terms of what's happened to particular occupations, so looking inside of administration, what we see that the big areas where we've seen, you know, big negative effects in terms of reductions in vacancies are these sort of what I think of as office adjacent sub-occupations. So things like secretarial occupations, things like other administration, right, which have taken a big hit in terms of this overall hit that administration vacancies have taken. In sales, we're seeing sort of a more broad-based reduction in vacancies across all of the different sub-occupations. Managers tend to be have been insulated from this reduction in vacancies, and interestingly, even this category of customer service, which is mainly call centres, has been hit hard by a reduction in labour demand in the sales occupations. So I think this data is pointing towards some extra restructuring scenarios that we need to consider for the post-pandemic economy, right? So we know that there's going to be this save our sandwiches effect and an effect related to hospitality, but we also have to be mindful of this effect in administrative and sales occupations. I think, one way to think of this is that, as remote work increases, if we think that there are particular jobs that are directly complementary to face-to-face office work, then those types of jobs will be pruned back. So the classic example there would be receptionists, which fall into the secretarial occupations, 3-digit occupation classification, right? So if you have a smaller office or you have no office, you don't need to hire a receptionist, right? And in that way, there's this sort of area of restructuring risk with respect to these office style occupations, which are directly complementary to face-to-face activities. So it's not clear when and how quickly this process of potential reallocation might happen, right? So at the moment, we still have the furlough in place. The furlough is due to be in place until October. I'd wager a small amount of money that would be at least a partial extension of the furlough. But I think this lets us sort of think about remote work in the context of sort of broader changes or the broader future of the labour market. And here I want to return back to this idea of remote work as this organisational technology, right? And thinking of remote work as an organisational technology allows us to sort of consider it alongside other big technologies, or what I think of as kind of super inventions. Okay. So as we all know, there's been lots of debate about automation, right? So, and in these debates about automation, there are technological optimists and pessimists, so people who think we're kind of going to a workless kind of apocalyptic future, people who think that more jobs will turn up and so on, right? There is that debate. What I want to focus on is that I think abstracting from that general debate, there are some particular developments that we can see coming down the pike, as they say, right? And so these are these particular super inventions that we know are being developed, right? So one example would be autonomous vehicles, which is going to hit road driving occupations over the next, let's say, 5 to 15 or 20 years, and then AI chatbot technology, which is set to gradually or potentially quickly displace call center style employment. Okay, and so I think there, no matter what you think about the automation debate, these technologies are coming along. They're going to have impacts on particular occupations. We can start to quantify those sorts of impacts on particular occupations, and look at what's at risk and what we're dealing with. And I think, as I said, you can think of remote work as an organizational technology, and I think it makes sense to sort of stack remote work alongside these super inventions like autonomous vehicles and chatbots in terms of considering the nature of like the sort of labour market impacts we might see in the 2020s and later on. Okay, so this is some stuff we've taken out of the UK Labour Force Survey, where we've identified this bunch of occupations that we sort of think of as occupations vulnerable to future shocks, right? So big displacing effects from new technologies like autonomous vehicles, chatbots, or the rise of remote work, right? And I think, the interesting thing to note here is in terms of these employment shares, like I think the classic example here is road transport drivers. So this will include truck drivers and taxi drivers. That takes up about 3% of the workforce. As a benchmark, modern manufacturing takes up about 10 to 12% of the workforce. These are big labour market segments, right? And this segment of kind of administrative occupations, other admin and secretarial occupations that we think are subject to restructuring risk from remote work are also big sub-occupations, kind of big areas of the labor market, right? And you can sort of see a scenario, like the nightmare scenario would be, we have a lot of these superventions come along and hit at the same time, and we have disruptions and strong displacement effects across all of these different segments of the labor market. And what we want to flag in this policy briefing and what we want to kind of inject into the debate is that sort of these foreseeable displacements, as we call them, from super inventions can be devastating if they concentrate in short periods, right? So that 3% number for the road driving workforce represents around 830,000 mostly male workers. And let's say a blockbuster video or a newspaper advertising style kind of industry disruption could have massive effects, right? So I would say that a rapid displacement of road drivers would be equivalent to one of the big waves of sort of industrial decline in manufacturing that we saw in the 1980s or early 1990s, right? And thinking about remote work and thinking about the sort of vulnerabilities that are coming into the view in the data, you can see that this office work segment is around as big as the driving workforce. In this case, you might think that the workers involved in administrative occupations might adapt better to these displacement shocks and the transition may be smoother. But this restructuring risk that office workers are facing from the uncertain future of remote work, you can think of as being much more imminent than the effects of AI technologies on white collar work, right? And so in that case, it's much more of an immediate threat. Okay, so I'm nearly there. Just hitting the 25-minute mark. So this is my conclusion. It's like the dark future, the clickbait conclusion, right? So, we've given you the main focus of where we want to end here is on this concept of restructuring risk, right? So at the moment, remote work is raising this potential restructuring risk in areas such as office occupations and sales occupations. This doesn't cover other areas of notional risk, right? So you could imagine potential big offshoring effects of professional work as professional work moves out of cities or moves out of countries to kind of less developed countries, for example, with cheaper labor. Another effect of remote work might be winner takes all market effects. Okay, so the case here would be, we don't need, dozens and dozens of different university lecturers in the UK teaching Econ 101 or Econometrics 101, right? We might only need a cluster of superstar lecturers with their video lectures and the rest of us just run tutorials, right? And that could radically change, academic labor markets. But so far there's little signs of this stuff happening. I think, we're going to be having lots and lots of economics and econometrics lectures for a little while yet. But where I want to end this is that, as I sort of indicated before, there's lots of slogans about what the future of the economy will be post-COVID. We can speculate about these new regimes, but, if we want to do something this year, I think we should try and nail what looks likely to pan out, right? And, we can pontificate about left behind workers all we want, and that's sort of what dominates a lot of debate. But there are these quantifiable areas of risk that we can easily identify, such as risks of displacement from things like autonomous vehicles, chatbots, and remote work. And we can sort of do an analysis and we can forecast, track, and build scenarios to sort of combat potential problems, that will come up later in the 2020s or the 2030s. Okay, so that's where I want to leave it. We'll go to questions. As a final point, I'll just foreshadow that this is part of work that we're going to package together in a big policy report that's coming in late in 2021 in October. So I call it the ultimate, or it'll have a more formal name in the end, the ultimate post-COVID new normal policy report. We're going to cover issues like well-being, the future of the City of London, comparisons with 1945, the end of sandwich shops, and topics like this, such as future shocks. So look out for that, and we'll go over to questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirko. There are a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is why not using the work from home tag that the BGT already provides? And the second part of it is, what is the latest data point when you show changes in vacancies?
Okay, good questions. Why don't we use the BGT tag? We don't have two reasons. We don't have that in our current version of the data set. So we're getting, so there's, bureaucratic reasons in terms of where we bought the data. We don't have it in our current version of the data set. We're getting that. In any case, doing it from scratch allows us to sort of look at the data more closely and make our own decisions in terms of the algorithm. In terms of the latest data on vacancies, I looked at that the other day. It depends on like which sort of series you look at. In some areas, like vacancies are back to normal relative to the pandemic. I think if I looked at the ONS vacancy survey when I looked at it kind of a couple of days ago, it was still in aggregate a bit below pre-pandemic levels, but I'd have to look at the data again to give the exact answer.
The next question is, how do these vacancies translate to full unemployment, and how much of this is covered by the furlough?
Okay, lots of good data questions. Yeah, so that's the big magic question. So how do vacancies translate into employment? So we haven't got a hard and fast answer for that yet, right? Because of the disruption over the period of the pandemic, right? So like I've been staring at the labour force. So I've been trying to square up the labour force survey data with the vacancies data. For example, look at how the stock of administrative and sales workers compares to the flow of vacancies. That's just too hard to read at the moment, right? So what we're not sure of, and maybe people in the audience or people who are from the ONS, for example, can advise us on this, is we're just not sure on what the LFS is picking up over the period of the pandemic. The effect of the furlough is the big question. It's just hard to work out what the workers are doing during the pandemic. And that to me is going to be a sort of a focus for research next year, is to work out what people did during the pandemic and what sort of labour market activity has been going on. So that's my best answer there. It's very hard.
Okay, the next one is, what are your thoughts on the prospects for new graduates entering the labor market in this unprecedented time?
Ooh, how can I say this? It's probably not good. So, yeah, it's been a while since I looked at the graduate vacancies, or the vacancies that go towards graduates. But I would expect that incumbent workers have been protected by definition, right? And any sort of reduction in labour market inflows, so that 15% reduction in inflows, any sort of reduction in inflows, even if it's only a 2 to 3% reduction in inflows, has got a big potential effect on both graduates or people coming out of school, right? So a non-graduate enters the labour market. And I think a big thing that we have to watch in terms of post-pandemic impacts is this cohort effect on the set of graduate and non-graduate young workers entering the labour market at this point in time, right? So there's plenty of research out there that's shown that sort of graduating in a recession or entering into the labour market during a recession has got ongoing effects on someone's sort of life cycle earnings. So I think that's a big priority for the post-pandemic period, is tracking those workers.
Are your preliminary findings available for citations right now?
Yes, so you can cite the briefing. You can cite the policy briefing. We should have a full academic paper out in the next 4 weeks or so.
Okay, so here's the next question. Would be curious to know whether you will consider and what your thoughts are on the productivity effects of remote working, including from agglomeration economies.
Okay, a lot of really good questions. I think so that some of the latest work, it would be sort of Paul Meisen's team, or from the decision makers panel, some work in the US has shown, I think, some early productivity enhancements from remote work in white collar work. And I think the latest data is showing that sort of meetings are getting longer. So we're getting slacker and sloppier at remote work. And then what was the second half of the question, Vishnu?
So agglomeration economies, what implications does it have for agglomeration economies in terms of, again, productivity effects?
Okay, so there I would think, the scenario that you want to sort of run there is, a 20 to 30% reduction in commuting. So it's essentially this effect. I think Max Nathan and Henry Overman, if you look at some of their posts on the ESRC Economic Observatory, they do a good overview of the likely sort of directions of the effect, right? So there what you're going to see is this effect on city centres, some activity move out towards like suburbs, but specifically in terms of agglomeration. Okay, so I think that's an interesting sort of point. And my controversial opinion there would be that I don't think remote work is going to kind of harm cities too much, right? So I think agglomeration economies, people's desire to be in dense locations like cities, that's a pretty big desire. It's probably baked into human nature, right? And agglomeration economies are really powerful. There's a reason cities grow and get bigger. There's a reason we get mega cities. And sort of in other work I've been doing, for example, on house prices, it just doesn't seem like sort of the pandemic has shifted around, let's say, urban, non-urban kind of house price premiums, right? So I think agglomeration economies are going to remain very, very strong.
So I don't see any other questions in the chat. So let me just ask my own question, which is, how do you see the demand for skills developing? Like, is there going to be a shift towards more high-skilled courses at the university level, for example? So, what will be the implications for the skills that we will see in the UK and demand for skills in the UK? And
okay, so good question. So I think, the way to think of this, if you look at the technological optimist versus pessimist debate, right? So the technological optimists, they say that, okay, we've seen this before. This has happened before and will happen again. We had these big periods of labor displacing technical change, like throughout the second half of the 20th century. What happened over those periods was that old jobs were displaced, but there were new jobs created. And in particular, there was lots and lots of different professional service type jobs created, right? And that sort of offset these kind of labor displacing effects. My concern for the future, right, is that it's not necessarily clear to me where these new jobs might be created, right? So these new professional service jobs. You're seeing a lot of jobs, and even if you look at the history of where these new professional service jobs or managerial jobs have been created, it's in particular, you've got developments like the rise of managerial jobs, right? And I'm not sure how much momentum is there for ongoing growth of managerial jobs, right? And it's just not clear kind of what are the services of the future. So that's point number one. Point number two is, will these people displaced from occupations such as road driving, such as kind of call center operation, will they be able to transition into these new professional services jobs, right? So these kind of non-routine jobs that still require human labor inputs, right? And I think that we sort of failed that challenge in the 1980s and 1990s in the aftermath of the recession in kind of developed economies like the UK. Like we really, really failed that challenge. And therefore, I'm not necessarily confident that if we have another big set of displacement challenges, such as autonomous vehicles, such as a restructuring of office work, that we won't be in the same sort of situation we've been facing in the last 5 to 10 years of kind of social and political discontent due to adjustment to economic change.
Thanks a lot. And then we have a few more questions.
Great.
Could the effect on new college graduates be mitigated by more people moving to early retirement due to the pandemic?
Good question. All right. I think, I think, my cynical side says that the only thing that will save us from big problems due to, let's say, displacement of road drivers to autonomous vehicles will be because those workers just age out of the labor market, right? So there could be some mechanical effect, right, just through aging. But in terms of early retirement, the direction of retirement is not, it's going in the other direction. So we've been increasing the retirement age because we're worried about the fiscal consequences of kind of a large retirement kind of payments burden, right? So even if it could alleviate that, that issue for graduate workers, it's just a very expensive thing to do.
Okay, so the next one, the restructuring you talked about, what does that imply for office space and costs?
I'd expect, it's lower demand. We're going to see some lower, okay, so what I expect to happen is we're going to have a lower demand for office space, but in cities like London, London is still going to be expensive for residential space and for office space, but it's not going to grow in the same way that it would have, right? So you're still going to see London being expensive. You're still going to see London prices for residential space and for office space increasing, but it's not going to increase as much as it would have in the counterfactual, right, of where the pandemic hadn't happened, right? And that kind of ties back to the earlier question of just how powerful these forces of agglomeration are, right? That, no matter how kind of radical the pandemic has been in terms of just fixing people into place and essentially reducing any amenity value from location from being in a big city, once things start back up again, these forces of agglomeration can be a major force to sort of reverting us back to sort of not quite the pre-pandemic equilibrium, but something reasonably close to it.
Okay, so the next one, what are the trends for the numbers of people freelancing or doing consulting or taking up self-employment? That is jobs that you can do from home. Do you have any numbers for that?
I haven't looked at the numbers for a while. There's some evidence, okay, in the US, I know there's some evidence of lots of business starts, right, small business starts. I haven't looked into that in the UK. I think there was some evidence recently of companies' house starts. What I think is like a big issue with interpreting data during the pandemic is teasing out these kind of structural changes of like, changes in entrepreneurship from people utilizing, let's say, different pandemic support schemes, right? So there, the classic example would be how businesses are using furlough and potentially misusing furlough, right? And so I think, entrepreneurship has gone up, but it's not something that's like so far to me jumping strongly out of the data, right? But it is definitely something to look at in terms of these sort of, it's the creative side of the creative destruction effects we might see as we come out of the pandemic.
Well, we are nearly out of time, but let me ask a last quick question. So you talked about the hospitality sector kind of bouncing back with relaxation of social distancing. But surely if lots of jobs are lost, there'll be some longer term effects on demand for these types of things, right?
Yeah, so I think there though, Vishnu, that, okay, that's the stuff that's most elastic to social distancing. So you're going to see this strong snap back just as, you know, people are able to do it again. And I see, I kind of lump that in the same box as agglomeration, right? So there's this, you know, agglomeration economies are strong. Human beings want to be together, right? Part of human beings wanting to be together is going out to a restaurant and going out to the pub, right? So I expect there's this strong force for that to revert back, right? There'll be demand for that in the future. And then I think the other factor that I haven't looked at for a while that we're going to have to kind of study in the wake of the pandemic is what's happened in terms of immigration in the UK and how that's going to affect different industries, right? Because it looks like, you know, we may be getting what a lot of people always wanted in terms of UK immigration levels, right? And we're going to have to see what that does for the labour markets of particular industries like hospitality and other sort of both low skill and high skill labour markets, like high skill labour markets in the City of London.
Okay, there's a last question. An increase in working from home may also mean that we need to expand the logistics and transportation sector. Have you seen any trends in these sectors that serve food to the people, for example, staying at home?
Haven't looked at the food thing, but there's definitely an increase in vacancies for van delivery drivers, right? So Amazon style delivery drivers, you can pull that out of the burning glass data and that spikes up like as you'd expect it. So definitely, and that's where some of the effects on retail trade will be mitigated as sort of stuff moves from retailing to the warehouse and from retailing to delivery.
So we are out of time. The last comment there is great stuff, Mirko, and I echo that. So
okay,
thank you for talking to us, and thank you all for coming and listening to this presentation. And I hope you keep track of the